Welcome back to the Law and Crime Trial Network. I'm Stacey Delikat. Welcome back to our Sirius XM Channel 109 listeners as well. As you just heard, the judge called a lunch break in the Boston courtroom where Shaun Harrison is on trial. If you're just joining us, Shaun Harrison calls himself a street pastor, a street preacher. He was known to many as the Reverend or the Rev. He was also a dean at English High School, and that's where prosecutors say he mentored at-risk students. But they say he had some of those at-risk students sell marijuana for him. One of those students was Luis Rodriguez, and prosecutors allege that when Luis Rodriguez didn't sell enough marijuana, didn't bring enough money in, Rodriguez tried to kill him, shooting him in the back of the head, execution style. Rodriguez did survive, but Harrison now on trial for attempted murder as well as weapons and drug possession charges. I'm joined by Ashley Willcott, an attorney and juvenile court judge from Atlanta. She's with us now via Skype. Ashley, thanks so much for being here.
Thank you, Stacey, for having me today.
So lots to talk about in regards to this trial today, but we just wrapped up with the witness, Laudy Arias, who was another student at English High School who had interactions with the Rev, with Shaun Harrison. Arias testified that Harrison asked Arias to beat up Luis Rodriguez for him. Or Arias said he was asked by Harrison to take care of him, to handle it, which he interpreted as beating him up. The testimony lasted about an hour or so. What were your impressions of this witness, and do you think he helps bolster the prosecution's case that Harrison was in fact dealing drugs and did intend to hurt or kill Luis Rodriguez?
So I have a lot of thoughts about this testimony. First is the defense's job is really to attack not only the devil is in the details and the facts of the testimony, but also really to attack the credibility of the witness. And I think, unfortunately, those listening may say, you know what, he didn't sound super credible. He didn't remember dates. He didn't remember what he previously said. He got confused on, oh, which date? Yes, they did take me to the police station. I thought you meant another date. I'm not criticizing him as a witness. I'm just saying those are real opportunities the defense had to say, okay, jury, this is not a really credible witness, so do not give his testimony a lot of weight. The other thing, Stacey, that I really thought was interesting was the defense said a couple of different times there were two different incidents, but you didn't report it to the police, did you? No. And you didn't report it to the principal, did you? No. And the thing that I will point out is these are teenagers. These are teenage alleged victims. And so you have a person, a defendant, who's in a position of power. He's a dean. He's an advocate. He's well respected because of the picture he's painted of himself. And if he's saying these things to these teenagers, they too are victims. And I got to be honest, of course they wouldn't report it, right?
Right, especially since this teen is admitting that he himself regularly smoked marijuana. He always had a source of marijuana. So you get the sense that this is not someone that's going to be running to the principal or the police every time something happens. And the fact that he seemed fine with beating up Luis Rodriguez shows you that, you know, perhaps he was not someone that would go to authorities to report something like this. So I do agree with you on that point. I want to bring up something else, which I thought was interesting. We heard this student, Laudy Arias, on the stand. He talked about going to Shaun Harrison's office, to the Rev's office in the school. And I know this was part of the back and forth defense trying to sort of pry out of him, how many times did you go to the office, what days, and he wasn't sure. One thing that was interesting, though, was he talked about several things that happened in that office, right? He said the Reverend showed him pictures of guns on his phone, and he said he saw a poster on the wall that he perceived to be associated with the Latin Kings gang. Now, something interesting that our viewers may not know is that police do allege that Shaun Harrison had ties to the Latin Kings gang. However, the judge ruled that that evidence could not be introduced at this trial, that the jury is not allowed to hear about Harrison's alleged ties to the Latin Kings. So what do you make of this, Ashley, the fact that the student who was in his office brings up this Latin Kings poster? Does that get the jury thinking, why would he have a gang-affiliated poster?
I think it might. Now, there may be a motion at a later point in time that the juries be instructed to disregard that testimony because of the previous court finding that it was prejudicial, that it was something that would not be allowed in trial. But I think the significance also is here is a man who, again, is held out as being and holds himself out as being very respectable and doing the right thing. And yet he almost has this whole plan of how can I best victimize? How can I best get these little teenagers, my word, not his, little teenagers, but these teenagers into my web of activity that he's allegedly engaged in that's a criminal activity, right? And so it's a subliminal way to do it, but a way nonetheless. If you have a poster that has to do with gangs on the wall, the other thing you have to start to question is, why would the school not know that, not realize, not recognize
Right.
if there's anything hanging on a teacher's wall that's anything nefarious or suggests criminal activity or gang activity? Certainly that's something they should step in and say not appropriate and what's going on with this particular teacher, in this case, Dean.
Right. I mean, that was a thought I had. Maybe he might display something like this in his home, but in the school, you would think that he might want to cover up those ties. Actually, I just want to talk big picture for a second about this case, because this is a case in which police say that Shaun Harrison was living a double life. They say, on one hand, here was a street preacher, well known in the community, well known to police. In fact, the police even said they never would have suspected him of a crime because he was involved in anti-gun efforts and trying to anti-gang efforts as well, trying to get guns off the street. But on the other hand, they say he was living this secret life where he sold marijuana to his students, had a cache of weapons, showed his weapons to the students, and then tried to murder one of them. How do you think the testimony we've heard today from this other student, Laudy Arias, and earlier today we heard from one of the detectives in the case as he read text messages between the victim and the suspect where they talk about dealing marijuana, how do you think that goes to proving this case that this man did lead a double life?
Well, again, the devil's in the details, and the jury's going to have to look at the totality of the circumstances and evidence. This is one very small piece and a bunch of evidence that's going to be presented to say, listen, in spite of everyone in defense and police saying, okay, he had a double life and he was a good person, he did have a double life, and here's the other criminal activity side that can be proven by all these individual witnesses taken together to say, yeah, he was leading another life and he actually was doing these criminal activities.
I should mention that, you know, after he was arrested, Harrison actually gave an interview to a local TV station from behind bars where he adamantly denied all of these charges, said, for me to be accused of something like that all of a sudden at 55, I turned gangster. It's a nightmare. You were trying to wake from this nightmare. Now, that was a few years ago after the charges were brought in 2015. But when you hear this interview, you know, where he adamantly denies the charges and still continues to, do you think he might take the stand to tell his side of the story?
You know, it's going to be interesting to see. In this particular case, I would not be surprised, because from his interviews thus far and everything that he has said and shared, I believe that he has an ego about it. Like, how dare anybody attack my reputation and everything I've accomplished, even if he did it. So it would not at all surprise me, even if it were against his attorney's advice, that he chooses to testify. The other part of this to always keep in mind, and we all see it, especially you, especially me, every day of the week, and that is, anybody could be a criminal. So someone who sounds like and holds themselves out as a leader and the best person in the world can be a criminal doing these things. It's not unheard of, certainly.
And it can surprise the police as well, as we said before, because after Harrison was arrested, someone from the police department said this was never someone they would expect would be involved in something like this. So to your point, you never do know. Ashley, thanks so much for the analysis. We're going to take a quick break. When we come back, we're going to have much more on the trial against Shaun Harrison. We're also going to talk about two other trials coming up this week that have lots going on in them. Stay with us. Well, jury selection now going on in that trial against Yesenia Sesmis. I am joined via Skype by Ashley Willcott. She's an attorney and juvenile court judge, and she's joining us today from Atlanta. Thanks again for being with us, Ashley.
Thank you, Stacey.
First thing I want to talk about, with jury selection going on, how difficult is it going to be for the attorneys on both sides to seat a jury in this case? Because this is such a disturbing case to any parent, right? To literally have your infant baby snatched away from you, and then, you know, if you have a loved one, if you're, you know, then to have the mother murdered. I mean, this is really a lot of people's worst nightmare, something you think comes right out of a TV show or a miniseries or something. So how difficult is it going to be to find a jury for this case, do you think?
Well, the emotional aspect is absolutely going to make it more difficult, as you've already pointed out. And part of the thing to keep in mind is that The jury questions could get very personal, right? They may end up asking women, have you ever had a miscarriage? Have you ever lost a child? Because those are the emotions that directly tie into this case. So it is going to be an emotional jury selection, which is not always the case. And I do think potentially those who are mothers or have children or have lost a child, whether it's a mother or a father or a family member, potentially are going to be struck from this jury.
Yeah, Yesenia Sesmis, again, accused of murdering Laura Abarca at her Wichita, Kansas apartment back in November of 2016. Again, the trial set to get underway soon, jury selection underway right now. Ashley, the suspect in this case, Yesenia Sesmis, is an undocumented immigrant. What role, if any, might that play in this case?
Listen, I might have said a few years ago it doesn't play a role, but the reality is now that's a hot topic in the news. That's a hot topic amongst politicians, as we all well know. And so that, I believe, is now going to play a role. I think there's going to be an argument, whether implied or stated outright by the state or by potentially the defense, hey, this is an illegal immigrant, and this is someone that shouldn't have been here in the first place. And by being here, they've committed this atrocious crime. So I do think it's going to be utilized in some way, shape, or form.
Sesmis allegedly told police officers after she was arrested that she had been faking a pregnancy to her boyfriend and stole Abarca's baby, then brought her back to Texas and presented the baby as her own. The fact that she has sort of admitted to this, what does that do for this case?
Well, you know what's surprising to me is that she's admitted to it, but yet she hasn't entered a plea, which is a little unusual. Often if someone's going to admit to these things, they end up entering a plea and they don't go to trial on the charges. And so I don't know what it means. I don't know if that means that possibly they're going to admit to an aspect of the charges, but not all of them. Clearly, I don't expect her to testify. Clearly, I think the defense is going to argue that it was an illegal confession or illegally obtained so that it can't be used against her. I think there are going to be some interesting legal arguments around that disclosure by her.
Yesenia Sesmis has been deemed competent to stand trial earlier this year by a local hospital. She underwent an evaluation where they determined that, yes, she could stand trial in this shooting death of Laura Abarca and the abduction of her baby girl. That baby, no longer a baby, really a toddler now. And it's expected that we could hear some testimony, of course, from some of Sesmis' family members. How does that play when you have this emotional testimony, this baby ripped from her mother's arms, and then the mother murdered in cold blood?
Can you imagine? It's just a horrific crime all the way around. And again, the emotional aspect of it, but also the heinousness of the crime, because it's one thing to kidnap a baby. You're looking at a whole different level of heinous crime when you don't only kidnap the baby, you actually murder the child to then kidnap the mother's child. And a family has lost a child that's the only connection to the mother who's been murdered. So actually, this is what I would call a sexy case, for lack of a better description, in terms of very emotional facts that are going to pull at everyone's heartstrings because it's such a heinous crime.
Yeah, I do agree with you there. And just to remind our viewers, jury selection going on right now in a Kansas courtroom in this murder case against Yesenia Sesmis. And as Ashley and I spoke about before, it could be difficult to find an impartial jury in this case. If you're the defense attorney in this case, what strategy would you pick?
Well, first of all, I'm going to pick the strategy of really looking at things that she may have admitted to, whether or not that's admissible, get rid of any of those admissions. And then I'm going to look at, although she's been declared competent, I promise you, I think they're going to delve into her life history, her upbringing, what might have happened to her. They're going to try to diffuse and bring some sympathy out to make the jury sympathetic to her actions. That's going to be tough to do, but I don't think they have a choice in this case. They're going to have to try to garner some kind of sympathy for this alleged, perpetrator who's done this.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think it will be very interesting to see how it plays out. And to your point earlier, this is a sexy trial. This is something right out of the movies or a TV a miniseries, a 6-day-old baby ripped from her mother's arms, mother then murdered. And so I do think there's going to be a lot of attention on this. This is a case that was, written about in People magazine when it happened and so forth. So it will certainly be interesting to see how that plays out when that trial gets underway. Again, that could be as soon as this afternoon or tomorrow morning out of Wichita, Kansas. Switching gears again, though, Ashley, I want to talk about another trial we have coming up that could begin any day now, and that is the trial against Wallace Brasher, who was a county district attorney who is on trial for a number of basically corruption charges, what's called a wife hiring scheme. We have a little recap. We'll come back and talk more about it. Welcome back. I'm Stacey Delikat, and welcome as well to our Sirius XM listeners joining us on Channel 109. We just heard a little bit about a trial we're expecting to start soon. That is a trial against Wallace Brasher, a former district attorney who is on charge for corruption, for what is being called a wife hiring scheme. Basically, the details are that he and another district attorney from another county conspired to employ each other's wives while allowing them to collect pay without actually working. I'm joined via Skype by Ashley Willcott. She's an attorney as well as a juvenile court judge. Ashley, this is an interesting case. As we just heard in that recap, Wallace Brasher basically denies these charges, has tried to get the trial thrown out, has even brought his own defamation lawsuit against people who have spoken out against him. How do you see this playing out?
Honestly, corrupt politicians. I think that a district attorney is someone who has the implied trust of the public and the community, because that's the person who's supposed to prosecute, uphold the laws, and hold criminals responsible for their activity. And here you have two, not one, but two different district attorneys allegedly making this agreement and, hiring each other's wives so they can make an income. In one case, I believe it was $48,000 unearned state income. So it's a significant amount of money. It violates the public's trust. I think this is going to boil down to corrupt politicians. I think it's absolutely going to get a lot of public attention in those communities.
Yeah, and again, this happening out of Greensboro, North Carolina, out of that area. I should add that the other district attorney who he is accused of conspiring with, that's Craig Blitzer from Rockingham County down in North Carolina, basically cooperated with prosecutors in this case and basically it has given information against Wallace Brasher. So that certainly hurts his case.
Absolutely. I mean, that's the fact of the matter. He's already turned state's witness, and he's already said, this is what we did and this is what happened. So good luck to that other district attorney. That's some pretty compelling evidence.
Yeah, and I should mention some of the charges against Wallace Brasher. They are felony conspiracy, obtaining property by false pretense, aiding and abetting. He also faces 3 counts of obstruction of justice and a misdemeanor failure to discharge the duties of his office. Ashley, I'm wondering, in the current climate that we're in, where people are so fed up with politicians, whether it's at the federal level, whether it's with the White House, whether it's with Congress not getting things done, whether it's corruption just at the state level. It seems like every day another high-level official is accused of some kind of misconduct. How do you think this trial plays in this climate where there is so much frustration over corruption, where there are so many calls to, quote-unquote, drain the swamp?
Right. I think that we're going to have a lot of public distrust and disgust about these particular charges against both of these individuals. But having said that, I'm going to say this. I think that even in our political climate, juries genuinely do try to apply the law that they're supposed to apply, that they're told these are the charges, to the actual facts that are presented at trial. And the reality is, if the facts are not presented that support those convictions, they may find that either one of these individuals is not guilty. So in spite of the political climate, I think that once it comes down to the actual trial, juries are good about doing what they're supposed to do in our justice system.
Well, again, that trial against Wallace Brasher out of the Greensboro, North Carolina area, we have jury selection underway in the courtroom right now. It could get underway as soon as this afternoon or tomorrow. So be sure to stay tuned for more on that case. Ashley, let's step back for a second and hear about some of the other top crime news today.
Here are today's top crime stories trending on lawandcrime.com and across the country.
Okay, welcome back. I'm Stacey Delikat, and I have Ashley Willcott joining me via Skype from Atlanta. Ashley is an attorney as well as a juvenile court judge. I want to just talk quickly about one of those stories because it's making a lot of headlines here in the New York area, and that is that incident of police beating up a woman on the beach on the Jersey Shore over the holiday weekend. It's turned viral, as you might imagine. That video has been viewed millions of times. At this point, now we have the mayor of Wildwood, New Jersey, speaking out, saying he too is disturbed by this video but wants to see more. There have been so many cases around the country where we see police caught on camera, whether beating someone up, abusing them, putting them in a chokehold, whatever it is, just straight out the gate when we don't even know too much about the circumstances. How difficult is this, you know, for police, for authorities when they are caught on tape, you know, in this case, punching a woman who just seems like a young woman who was just on the beach. Again, not knowing the circumstances that led up before. What does the video alone say?
Sure. So, Stacey, I would say what you just said, which is they literally are punching her in the face. She is 20. So is she an adult? Yes, but she's a young adult. Even if she had alcoholic beverage on her, you can tell from the way she's dressed in a bathing suit, maybe shorts. It's not as if she has a gun on her. I think that you could see if she had a gun, a weapon, a bottle, she was going to hit him over the head, some reason that they literally had to do something to prevent her from attacking. From what I saw in the video, that doesn't appear to be the case in this situation. Personally, I don't think that there's any excuse reason for punching in the face unless that person is a threat to the immediate safety of the police officer. I don't know what the entire video shows, but that clip we saw, it sure doesn't look to me like she's posing a threat.
Now, this young woman alleges that police did approach her and her friends. They suspected that she was underage. She claims in a Facebook post that they gave her a breathalyzer test, which she passed, and then she walked away, said something like, "Don't you have something better to do?" Then chase around kids like me. She said that they demanded she give them her name. She wouldn't, and that's when she was tackled to the ground. Now, again, there are some people heard on the video yelling, "Stop resisting." Even if she was resisting, as you said, that doesn't necessarily give police the authority to punch her in the head, right?
Right, unless, again, she's a threat to their physical safety. If she has a weapon, if there's some reason that they fear she's going to hurt someone in the crowd or ourselves. But I don't see it in this case. There's no excuse to punch somebody in the head because they're resisting arrest, unless some of those extenuating factors we just discussed exist.
Now, as we just heard in Anthony's piece, that young woman charged with aggravated assault on a police officer, aggravated assault by spitting on an officer, we don't know. Perhaps that preceded this: disorderly conduct, resisting arrest, obstruction, and possessing alcohol as a minor. I want to add that we have heard that the city of Wildwood expects to release the officer's body cam footage sometime in the next few days. So perhaps that will give a more comprehensive look at the situation. However, again, she's facing charges, but do you imagine this woman is already talking to attorneys about what charges she may bring now against the county, against the police department?
Oh, absolutely. I cannot imagine that that has not happened.
Yeah, I imagine that is something we will probably be hearing about soon. And given that this is already just in a couple of days, really 24 hours, such a high-profile case, I do expect we'll be hearing a lot more about this one. Well, we do want to reset now and go back to some of the big trials that we have been following so far today on the Law and Crime Network. The one we've been listening to all morning, of course, the case against Shaun Harrison. He is the Boston area street preacher. He was known as the Reverend or the Rev. Apparently, he had a long history of working on the streets with kids, doing anti-gang programs, doing gun buyback, stuff like that. But prosecutors say he was living a double life because on the side, he himself was dealing drugs, had guns, and was recruiting some of the at-risk students he worked with at a Boston area high school to sell drugs for him. So I think there's a lot of interest in this case, Ashley, because of this sort of idea. Why would a teacher try to shoot one of his students, first of all? Also, this happening in a big city like Boston. So having followed the trial so far, what do you think has been some of the most interesting testimony?
So I think some of the most interesting testimony are from the juveniles, right? Because even though it may sound like, well, gosh, they're not real credible, they can't remember time frames, the reality is they don't have any motive to make this up and to say he's asked us to do this, or he said, okay, you got to go handle it, take care of it, and I'm going to take that to mean I was supposed to fight him. I think that we need to look at the fact that he is a person of power and a powerful position, and what better people to prey on? If he did this, what better people to prey on than at-risk youth? They already have trauma that they've endured in their life. They already are vulnerable. So those are the perfect victims from his perspective. So I really think all those individual witnesses are important to take together and look at what they're saying happened.
Absolutely. Now, the victim in this case is Luis Rodriguez. He was one of the students at English High School who Shaun Harrison allegedly took under his wing, who he mentored. And from what we've heard in this trial so far, Shaun Harrison at one point started asking Luis Rodriguez to sell marijuana from him. The allegation is that when Rodriguez didn't bring in enough money, or perhaps threatened to tell on Harrison to authorities, that Harrison wanted him handled. We heard just a little earlier this morning some testimony from the case in which another student said Harrison asked him to handle what he interpreted to mean beat up Rodriguez because Rodriguez might tell on Harrison. Rodriguez himself ended up being shot in the head execution style, prosecutors allege, by Harrison. There was that shooting was caught on surveillance video. And last week, Rodriguez himself took the stand, perhaps some of the most captivating testimony yet. So I want to go back now. Let's listen to some of that, and then we'll come back out and discuss it. Welcome back to the Law and Crime Trial Network, and welcome back to our Sirius XM listeners. We've been listening to testimony from Luis Rodriguez. He is the 18-year-old teenager who was shot in the back of the head, execution style, he says, and prosecutors say, by Reverend Shaun Harrison. Shaun Harrison, a street pastor in Boston who was also a dean at English High School, who prosecutors say befriended at-risk students, mentored them, but then asked them to sell drugs for him. Now, the testimony we just heard listened to was actually a defense cross-examination of Luis Rodriguez when they're asking him, why didn't you tell people right away that Shaun Harrison, the Reverend, shot you? Ashley Willcott joining me via Skype. Ashley is an attorney and juvenile court judge. She's with us from Atlanta, and thanks again for being with us, Ashley. Do you think, it's sort of easy to understand that he might have been a little panicked after getting shot in the head and that his primary concern was surviving as opposed to saying who did this to him, right?
Absolutely. So to me, what is one of the reasons that this individual who holds himself out as a pillar of the community would actually go to the extreme of shooting a student in the back of the head? To me, it's that risk of exposure, fear of exposure. And so if I were that student that got shot, I too would think, oh my gosh, he'll go to any lengths to get rid of me, to silence me, to not be exposed. So I have to be really careful what I say. I'd also be thinking, oh my gosh, are you kidding me? Did he just really shoot me? You'd be in shock. And so I don't think you can give that a whole lot of weight. There are a lot of reasons. Again, a teenager without a fully developed brain is going to say that or try to think of self-preservation. How do I protect myself first?
Not to mention with a major injury, and we can see on the stand that he appears to have lasting effects from the shooting. Part of his face almost seems paralyzed a little bit. I want to read some of what his original direct testimony was when he was on the stand with prosecutors. He describes being shot. He says, all I felt was a loud bang. I hit the floor. I was dazed. He says he looked around. There was no one there. And he says he had to flag down a car for help. We heard the defense attorney, Bruce Carroll, asking him, did you tell the driver who shot you? He had said no. He also says that there's no doubt in his mind that Shaun Harrison did it. When he's up on the stand, the district attorney, David Bradley, asked him who shot him. He essentially pointed, said, no doubt in my mind that Shaun Harrison did it. So when you have a witness pointing the finger at a victim in court, how effective is that for jurors?
Oh, gosh, that's huge. I mean, you have a first-hand positive ID of the defendant in the courtroom. That's some of the best evidence from a state's prosecution standpoint that you can have. And again, what would his motive be to lie? Why would he make this up about this dean of school? It's hard to imagine a reason that he would.
Yeah, I agree with you. What would be his motivation to lie? What's interesting to me in this case, though, is Harrison obviously didn't want to be found out. At least that's the case that the prosecution is painting, that he perhaps was worried that Luis Rodriguez, this student, this mentee of his, might tell others in the school, might tell the authorities that he was involved with drugs, that he had guns, whatever it was. Also, there is this allegation that Harrison was not happy with the amount of money he was bringing in with his marijuana sales, Luis Rodriguez. Still, though, it's a big leap for me to think that he would say, well, I'm just going to kill the kid, right? This is a guy who has a clean criminal record. Police even said they were surprised he was behind this because he's known in the community as being a street preacher for working with young people. So it's surprising to me that his first thought, or, you know, maybe it wasn't his first thought, that he would say, well, I'm just going to kill this kid. Is there any question of motive there for you?
Well, I think that, again, if this child were about to expose him, to tell on him, desperate times call for desperate measures, that might be enough motivation. And I do not believe that he meant to injure him. I do believe that the goal was whoever shot him meant to kill him. And so I just think that that comes into play, and it just wouldn't surprise me.
Yeah, I mean, he did shoot him in the head execution style, and Rodriguez really is lucky to be alive after that, lucky that he was able to get up and flag down a car and make it to the hospital in time. A little bit more background from Rodriguez's testimony on the stand late last week. He said that Harrison had, taken him under his wing. He knew him as the dean at English High School. He says that Harrison then offered him to provide him with marijuana to sell on the condition that Rodriguez give him the proceeds. He said something like, do you want to make money? Rodriguez testified, I was confused because as a student, a teacher coming up to me asking if I want to make money is kind of awkward to me. But again, Ashley, to your point, this is someone in power. This is an at-risk teenager who probably would like to make a little bit of extra money. So is it easy to see how he was able to sort of bring these teenagers in on his plan?
Well, absolutely. He picked the most vulnerable victims that he could. And who's going to believe them? Think about that. They probably know in their mind, like, I got to tell a principal or police, who's going to believe me? I'm a nobody. I'm a teenager, and I've had all these issues in my life. And he's a pillar of the community that everyone respects, that holds himself out, that's the dean of the school. Why would they believe me?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, thank you, Ashley, for that analysis. We're going to take a quick break just to remind our viewers and listeners the Shaun Harrison trial on a lunch break right now. We expect it to resume shortly. We're going to take a break here on Law and Crime. When we come back, we'll have much more analysis of this trial. Stay with us. Welcome back to the Law and Crime Trial Network, and welcome back to our Sirius XM listeners as well. We've been listening to testimony from Luis Rodriguez from last week. He is the teenager from Boston who was shot in the head execution style, and prosecutors and police say it was by Shaun Harrison, Reverend Shaun Harrison, as he was known, who was a dean at English High School where Luis Rodriguez was a student. Now, we've just been listening to some cross-examination by defense attorneys, and I have Ashley Willcott with me via Skype from Atlanta. She's an attorney and juvenile court judge. Ashley, we just heard some testimony from Luis in which he talks about the details about how he says Harrison would call him in for meetings and then would bag up marijuana. They would talk about how much weed he would get, how much to sell it for, and so forth. But one thing that's interesting is we haven't heard much testimony from any adults, as you had mentioned to me before, from any other people at the school, that they had any sense that Harrison, or the Rev, as he was known to students, was dealing drugs. In fact, the headmaster at English High School already testified in the trial before Rodriguez was on the stand last week, and she told the jury how she found out that The student, of course, had been shot. Rodriguez had been shot. When she went to tell Harrison about the shooting the next day, she said he clutched his chest, breathed heavily, he had heart palpitations. I actually thought he was going to have a heart attack, she said, which suggests that she had no idea that there was any kind of interaction between them or anything, you know, certainly nothing involving drugs or anything like that between him and the student, right?
That's right. And so I think something that's notable in this case, he'd only been at that school for 2 months when this shooting happened. Prior to that, they say that there's a history of him moving around, which is not unusual at that level of a job, from school to school. And so they didn't have one clear history picture of this individual in terms of interactions with students, whether or not there'd been any drug involvement or any inappropriate actions or criminal activity. The other thing when we talk about adults, Stacey, that you and I briefly mentioned that I'd like to raise is when the police executed a search warrant on Shaun's home, Shaun Harrison's actual home, there were 3 other adults, and one of them had guns, one of them had drugs, one of them had a police scanner. And so I would submit that's telling of something, right? Those kinds of adults with those kinds of guns and drugs it's not someone you hang out with, right? If you are not engaged in any criminal activity or you're doing the right thing, stand-up community member. And whether or not they were removing items from the defendant's home, I don't know. I'm just saying it seems a little nefarious that an individual would be hanging out with these kinds of characters unless they themselves were engaged in some type of activity that was not appropriate and criminal.
Ashley, absolutely. That's a good point, and that's something I want to explore further. But first, we have to take a quick break, and we'll be back with much more on the Shaun Harrison trial. Stay with us. Welcome back to the Law and Crime Trial Network, and welcome back to our Sirius XM Channel 109 listeners. I'm Stacey Delikat, and all day we have been talking about the trial of Shaun Harrison out of Boston. Right now, that trial on a lunch break, but court expected to resume any minute. As soon as it does, we will bring it to you live. In the meantime, attorney and juvenile court judge Ashley Willcott and I have been discussing this case, some of the testimony we've heard so far. Ashley joining us live via Skype from Atlanta. Actually, right before we took this break, you brought up an interesting point, which is when police went to serve the search warrant at Shaun Harrison's home, not only did they find guns, ammunition, and marijuana, but there were also 3 adult men leaving who had guns, marijuana, and a police scanner on them. You had mentioned that's certainly a sign of someone involved in nefarious activities. We had talked about before how police have said they believe Shaun Harrison has ties to the Latin Kings gang. But the judge said that evidence cannot be introduced in this trial. Do you think that, well, first of all, for our viewers and listeners who may not have known that, why would the judge say that the prosecutors cannot bring in the fact that they think Shaun Harrison was affiliated with this gang?
Right. So gang membership, number one, that information the court might have found was highly prejudicial and outweighed the usefulness or admissibility of it and would say, okay, you can't bring it in prosecution for that reason. The other thing is an alleged gang activity might have really nothing to do with the charges of the intent to murder and other criminal charges that this defendant is facing, because he's facing those actions whether or not there was any alleged criminal activity, gang activity.
So the 3 individuals that were seen leaving his house, again, we don't know too much about them and their relationship, but that also sort of paints a picture that he's involved in criminal activity, right? Why else would you have these people at your home?
Well, that's what I would argue if I were the state. Why else would you be hanging out with individuals? We like hangs out with like, and so all of us choose friends, acquaintances that we have similar things in common with, that we like, that we want to hang out with. And so if you're hanging out with individuals that are criminals and in possession of guns and drugs, what does that say about you and where your interests or activities are?
Yeah, absolutely. Great point there, Ashley. Right now, we're going to go back and replay some of the testimony from the victim in this case, Luis Rodriguez, who was shot in the head execution style, he alleges, by Shaun Harrison, the Rev. He did manage to survive, and last week he was on the stand telling his side of the story. So let's go back, pick up on some of that cross-examination by defense attorneys now. Welcome back to the Law and Crime Trial Network, and welcome back to our Sirius XM listeners. If you're just joining us, we have been recapping some of the trial of Shaun Harrison. He is the Boston Reverend street preacher and also a dean at a Boston public school, English high school, who is accused of trying to murder one of his students who he mentored, a student who prosecutors say he turned into a drug dealer of sorts. Ashley Willcott has been here with me all morning, or all afternoon, I should say, breaking down some of the key elements of this trial, and she's still with us via Skype from Atlanta. So just to remind viewers, we are on lunch break. Court expected to resume any minute, and when it does, we will take you back there live. But first, Ashley, we've been listening to Luis Rodriguez. He is the victim in this case, and arguably the prosecution's star witness, talking about what happened to him, the moments he remembers after being shot in the head, in the back of the head, by, he says, the Rev. We've been listening to the defense team cross-examining him. Earlier today, we saw another student from the school up on the stand, and we listened to a lot of cross-examination from the defense team. Would you say in this case as well, from what we were just listening to of Luis Rodriguez on the stand, it seems like they are trying to discredit him? Because, again, they're asking him, why didn't you say right away that it was the Rev who shot you? They're asking a lot of detailed questions, right? Really trying to split hairs here.
Yeah, absolutely. And so what they're trying to say is, on one hand, you say you were in shock because you'd been shot. On the other hand, you had your wits about you to say to the police, yes, I have a knife. Here's my knife. Here's where defense has to be really, really careful, in my opinion. When they're questioning Luis, he is a victim of a gunshot to the back of the head. A jury's already sympathetic. He's the victim. And if they are too aggressive or go after him too much to say, you don't even know what you're talking about, you were in shock, you had a knife, you did this, you did that, it can really turn a jury against a defense, in my opinion, because if they feel like they're attacking this victim who's been shot in the back of the head, they may start to side against the defense. So you have to be really careful. There's a fine line between pointing out the discrepancies in the testimony versus attacking or being too aggressive and making a jury even more sympathetic to the victim and angry at the defense.
From what we've heard of the last bit of testimony from when Rodriguez was on the stand being cross-examined by the defense, have they crossed that line yet, in your opinion? I
kind of felt like they started to, right? When they were saying, you were in shock, and then he kind of started to mumble on his words and say, I was in shock, but I just been shot, I just been shot. And they said, yes, but you also said you had a knife, and you were able to tell the police you had a knife. That's where I felt like they were starting to go a little bit too far, because he's trying to explain, I've been shot in the back of the head. I was in shock. I was just trying to live. I thought I was going to die. So at that point, they need to be real careful. That's where I felt like it started to get a little bit dicey in terms of their aggressiveness.
Yeah, absolutely. And for our viewers and listeners who are just joining us, again, this is a case, an attempted murder case against a Boston teacher, a dean of students at English high school, who was known as a street preacher. He was called the Reverend, or the Rev for short, especially by the teenagers, the at-risk youth that he mentored. What's interesting about this case is that prosecutors and police allege that Harrison was living a double life. They say, on the one hand, here is this community advocate who works with teenagers on the streets, who runs anti-gang programming, who talks to kids about not getting involved with drugs and gangs. But they say, on the other hand, in secret, he himself was dealing drugs. He himself had a cache of weapons, and he was recruiting some of these students to sell drugs for him. Really two different pictures of a man here. And as we talked about a little bit earlier, Ashley, Shaun Harrison has adamantly denied these charges. He says he didn't shoot Luis Rodriguez. He denies giving drugs to the students to deal. So, let's go back and talk about again whether Shaun Harrison himself might get on the stand to deny these allegations and tell his side of the story.
Sure. Denial, denial, denial. A lot of criminals are going to deny and be in denial. And this is a case where it wouldn't surprise me if he chooses to testify, even if his attorneys say, don't testify. We think that we've shown reasonable doubt. If they feel that way at the conclusion of the evidence, you don't need to testify. I think that he is, his ego is wrapped up in this, and the amount and how vehemently he denies, he may want the opportunity to be heard to make that denial. The other thing is, this is a great ruse, right? If he did this, boy, what a great place to act like I'm above all of this. I would never do this. I'm not engaged in this activity. I help these youth. Great ruse if he did it.
And basically, he told a Boston TV station as much when he did an interview from prison shortly after the charges were brought. He basically said, I've spent my whole life trying to help these kids. I would never do this. Facing these charges, he said, it's like a nightmare I can't wake up from. I believe that was the direct quote. So clearly, he has some adamant denials. As you said, court should be back in session any moment, and as soon as it is, we will bring the stream to you live. In the meantime, we're going to take another short break, but stay with us. We'll be back with much more.